Welcome to the Money Flow. I am Faaria Tasin, economist and host of this show, and today we are discussing Bangladesh's macroeconomy and observing Bangladesh from a global perspective. Bangladesh is set to graduate from the International Development Association, commonly known as the IDA program, which allows the World Bank Group to provide concessionary finance to Bangladesh. Would the graduation bring opportunities for Bangladesh? What type of challenges is the country expecting? To answer these questions, we have Susan Lund, Vice President, Economics and Private Sector Development from the International Finance Corporation. Susan Lund oversees IFC's research and thought leadership and identifies opportunities to use blended concessional finance to enable investments in countries such as Bangladesh. Before joining IFC, she spent over 20 years as a partner at McKinsey & Company. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Association of Business Economists, and the Bretton Woods Committee. She holds a PhD in Applied Economics from Stanford University. Now let us go straight into the discussions. Susan, you're one of the most senior leaders in IFC and in charge of economics and private sector development. You've had a brilliant career so far. Before joining IFC, you've spent over 20 years as a partner at McKinsey & Company. So welcome to Bangladesh and thank you so much for coming to my show.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
What is your view regarding the evolving macroeconomic situation in South Asia, especially in Bangladesh? Significant factors that come to mind are commodity price inflation, the strengthening of the dollar, and the rise in interest rates.
Well, it's a challenging environment around the world. And frankly, Bangladesh, which will grow somewhere north of 6% this year, is in a really enviable position. But as you mentioned, the country's hitting a rough spot. It's been very challenging between the COVID-19 lockdowns followed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has sent commodity prices and food prices soaring, that lots of countries are grappling with higher inflation, which means higher interest rates, which means higher cost of borrowing. And that's been a shock. Most of us, even people of my age, not your age, and older, have lived their career in an environment of low interest rates. So globally, interest rates have been falling since about the early 1980s. And we got to what economists call ultra-low interest rates just prior to the COVID-19 lockdown. So now we're grappling with a very different scenario of inflation that's proving more difficult to control than central bankers would like, and therefore a higher interest rate environment. So Bangladesh, like other countries, faces some challenges, but it was fast in asking for a line of credit from the IMF and has been undertaking reforms that I think will really put the country in good stead for the medium and long term.
Yes, we are also looking forward to that and, expecting better times indeed. Now, Bangladesh is one of the fastest growing economies in the world with an average economic growth rate of over 5% in the last 30 years. Now, as a consequence, it will graduate from the International Development Association, commonly known as the IDA program, that allows the World Bank Group to provide concessionary financing to countries such as Bangladesh. Now, on one hand, it is a cause for celebration and it is very commendable. On the other hand, there are some challenges. Now, what is your take on that?
Well, first, I agree with you that it is commendable that Bangladesh will be graduating from IDA. And it's really a testament to the rapid growth and the sustained rapid growth that you talked about, which has been driven by smart government policies along with a really vibrant private sector that's emerged, particularly in the ready-made garment industry. Graduation will mean the end of the highly concessional funding, but it will also open up a wider array of financing options for the government and for the private sector. So some of the work we've been doing with the World Bank has been on developing the corporate financing options, whether it's in the bond market, and particularly green bonds, and increasingly we're working with banks and others to issue blue bonds devoted to water resources, or equity markets, or a whole different array of borrowing options from commercial lenders as well as international bond markets.
Okay. Susan, can you give us an example of what are green or blue bonds?
So green and blue bonds are bonds that can be issued either by banks or by companies. A green bond is associated with climate and the environment.
Yes.
A very closely related concept would be a sustainability bond or a sustainability linked bond.
Mm-hmm.
So these are bonds in which the issuer will issue to the market and say, we're going to use the proceeds to finance certain climate-friendly projects or environmental projects.
Okay.
The sustainability-linked bonds, which is a different flavor of a green bond, would actually say, we're going to hit certain targets, say in emissions reduction. And when we do, there may be an interest rate buy down. So the borrower gets a little bit of a benefit, but they have to meet stated and agreed upon targets. Okay. So it's a way of tapping into some of the global investment money that's out there that's targeted towards what's known as ESG or environmental, social, and governance types issues. And this is, trillions of dollars are now in ESG related funds looking for opportunities. So the green bond market is one way for an issuer to signal that we're serious about climate change and then hopefully tap into this pool of money. A blue bond is similar, and it's related to water resources. So that could be, for instance, urban water projects. It could be freshwater fisheries. It could also be ocean and marine resources, but anything related to water. And it's a similar concept. Now, for all of these bonds, the key is in standards and monitoring and enforcement. So IFC is proud to have been working with other development finance institutions to set some of the standards for what qualifies as a green bond, what is the taxonomy that governments need to adopt to enable issuance of these bonds. And similarly for blue bonds, you need some regulatory framework to state what qualifies as a blue bond or not. And then you do need the understanding of either banks or companies who are issuing these bonds, what they're signing up for. And ultimately, you need monitoring and enforcement. Right now, it's, of course, still relatively early days of these markets, and there's been some backlash about greenwashing, or companies who are issuing green bonds, but then not necessarily following through on their commitments. So as with all new markets and instruments, there's some work to be done, but overall it's a way of raising climate finance.
Okay, that is very interesting now. Now, Susan, from the perspective of private sector development and investment, what are the comparative advantages of Bangladesh relative to countries such as India or Vietnam, in your opinion?
Well, I'll start with Bangladesh's geography. You sit between South and Southeast Asia, I think the two fastest growing regions in the world. And so there's a big opportunity, I think, based on this position to facilitate trade, investment flows. So that's one benefit. I think a second thing is Bangladesh has a very vibrant private sector, as I mentioned earlier, that you have for, let's take the ready-made garment industry. It grew up from almost nothing in a matter of
a few decades only.
Few decades to be really world-beating and a very large producer of exports. Now Bangladesh garment industry is really also becoming a leader in, say, the environmentally sustainable garment manufacturing. So IFC has worked with some of the manufacturers, about 400 factories, on something called the Partnership for Clean Textiles. And it reduces water. It works on water treatment, it reduces the energy required, and overall has had amazing success, such that Bangladesh, I think, has the largest number of certified green garment factories in the world, and something like 8 or 9 of the 10 largest green garment factories. So that's a success story. So this entrepreneurial spirit, but also the whole ecosystem of talent, of skills, of management, is one of the benefits. Now, for Bangladesh to continue, especially as it graduates from IDA and is on its journey to higher middle income status, I think it'll be important to diversify beyond just one major export industry. And there are areas of the economy that still need to see some structural reforms. So access to finance continues to be an issue, and some of the banking reforms will, I think, help bring down the cost of financing and broaden access in Bangladesh. Transportation and logistics is always important. As much as we love the digital world, particularly in manufacturing, you need to get products around, you need to get them in and out of the country. And so that's a big area for development. And then energy is a big area for development, particularly renewable energy. Bangladesh, like other countries, has signed up to the Paris Climate Accord and has nationally determined contributions that it needs to make. In addition, if we take the example of the garment industry, buyers of garments are demanding green factories. So Bangladesh has started down this pathway, but there are many more factories that now need to comply. So that's a journey that will keep going, and all of this will require large amounts of renewable energy in addition to factory efficiency. So solar power will be a big factor. Either rooftop or commercial scale solar. IFC is proud that we're investing in a commercial scale solar plant and also rooftop solar. I was just in Nepal and Bhutan, where there's a lot of investment going on in the hydropower sector. Okay. And both countries have massive hydro resources with the rivers coming from the Himalayas. And there's some work going on about developing regional power trading agreements between Nepal, India, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. And the hydropower from those two countries could supply a large amount of the clean energy needs in Bangladesh and India as those agreements develop and the transmission lines are built.
Okay. Now, Susan, you visited Bangladesh twice in the last 6 months. Has anything stood out to you in terms of an encounter with an IFC client or a partner? If you could share with us.
Well, so many things stand out to me. I had the pleasure of meeting with the leader of BROC, which, of course, Bangladesh is known for microfinance. And it was fantastic to hear about how it's grown and has spread to other countries in the world. I had the pleasure of meeting with some of the clients of an agent banking network in one of the villages outside of Dhaka. And for instance, I met this beautiful young woman who started out with a small loan, having one dairy cow, and it's expanded to 10, and now she's diversifying into broiler chickens.
Oh, that's great.
It's the kind of stories that really bring to life, first of all, the entrepreneurial drive and spirit in this country, and how just small amounts of money through microfinance can really change somebody's entire family, not only for herself, but her husband and 2 children. So that was certainly a highlight. Continuing on the theme of women leaders, I also had a very interesting tea with women executives and leaders in the social sector and public sector in Bangladesh. And it was amazing to hear their stories. Of course, there's a long way to go on women in the workforce and women in leadership. But it was great to hear their stories and some of the challenges that they've faced and how they've overcome it. So I visited a textile factory that is one of the IFC ILO's Better Work programs. So I got to see the nursery, the very nice, standards of the workplace. And it's been really inspiring to see what's happening on the ground.
Okay. Now, Susan, we're going to talk a little bit more about climate change, which is one of the most important topics of current times. Where do you see Bangladesh in terms of climate risk right now?
Well, Bangladesh, according to the World Bank Group's Country Climate and Development Report, it came out, I believe, last December, is the 7th most vulnerable to climate change, of course, because of flooding. And so it's a big challenge that unchecked, this could really hit the economy, and it could derail the development trajectory that the country's on. In a severe flooding scenario, I think the report finds that you could lose 9% of GDP.
Yes.
So it is a big risk. The report estimates that we need over $170 billion of investment in mitigation and adaptation over the period of a decade to make Bangladesh more resilient. Now, that 172 billion, much of it will be private sector, but a large share is also private sector investment. So from a private sector perspective, it's also an opportunity in many industries. So for instance, in renewable energy, it's an investment opportunity with good returns. Also, as you think in other industries, so for instance, buildings and green buildings. IFC works around the world, both with banks providing mortgages and building finance, but also with construction companies to actually build in up to green standards like the international LEED standards, or we've developed a similar framework called EDGE. And green buildings consume less energy, they consume less water, they're more sustainable, they have more built-in natural passive heating and cooling being the important thing here. And so this is possible, not only for commercial office buildings,
but also for residential, I believe.
But for residential and for affordable housing. You can build affordable housing that's now green. So there are big opportunities, I think, to build differently than we have in the past, and invest differently than we have in the past. So while all countries in the world are feeling the climate risks, Bangladesh included, with the flooding, but you see it around the world. I'm from the United States, and the wildfires in the summer creating smoke in large cities. The smoke on the East Coast in Washington, where I come from, is coming from wildfires in Canada. I've lived in Washington for, over 25 years, and I don't remember wildfire smoke in Washington until this summer. So everywhere around the world, we're really seeing, whether it's unprecedented heat waves or huge storms and flooding, the effects of a changing climate.
Is IFC doing anything particularly to address climate change, especially for the private sector?
We're doing a lot to ramp up our climate finance. At IFC last year, we were proud that our climate finance was over $14 billion of climate-related investments. It was just under 40% of our overall commitment portfolio, and we aim to continue at that level or even grow. We're investing not only in the renewable energy generation, but increasingly really across any sector, whether it's building, as we talked about, whether it's manufacturing efficiency, green production of cement and steel, electric vehicle, transportation. I mean, almost any industry. Agriculture, there's climate smart agriculture.
Yes.
There are ways to build hurricane and weather resistant structures that's similar to green, but it's a little bit different, to have reinforced buildings. So for island nations, or for instance in the Delta or in the Bay of Bengal, like that'll be really important to protecting people's homes and livelihoods. So we're working across industries to help companies and ultimately individuals adapt to the world's changing climate.
Bangladesh is an example of a development success story. Now, in order to attain a greater economic prosperity, what are some of the challenges that the country needs to address immediately?
So I think that to continue the growth model, as we talked about, it's challenging times for all countries, but there are some things that you're going to need. So Bangladesh's own plans to become a high middle income country will require foreign direct investment, for instance, to go from about 1% of GDP to 3% of GDP. Now, investors look for what I'll broadly call the business environment, right? Is there certainty about regulations, including taxes? Is foreign investment able to come into different sectors? Are you able then to get the inputs that you need in a timely way and in a cost-effective manner? And are you able, if you're an export-oriented industry, to export the goods? This requires some changing of the exchange rate policy. I know that the multiple exchange rates have been narrowing in Bangladesh, which is a great trajectory to be on. So there are some policy reforms, both overall in the country as well as sector specific, that are holding back some private sector investment. And the government has been addressing those. And as it continues on this path, We'd like to see more foreign direct investment. And I will mention that IFC, of course, invests in companies directly, but we also want to bring in other investors. Our mandate is not just to invest our own balance sheet, but really to mobilize other private sector investors and bring them along with us to come to Bangladesh and invest.
Okay. And now, Susan, this is my last question. As a female senior leader in the world's most prestigious development institution, what advice would you give to young aspiring leaders?
Well, I would say you can do it. Bangladesh is a success story in women's labor force participation in South Asia. It has the highest share of women working, but South Asia has the lowest share globally. So there is room to go. And the textile industry is one reason it has high labor force participation. But as you look up the ranks at management and owners and then boards of directors, of course, the number of women fall off very dramatically. And the tea that I hosted with women executives, it was interesting to hear some of their challenges, which are similar to what I hear and have experienced in my own career over the years, right? There's, first of all, being the only woman. It takes sometimes courage to get used to being the only woman in the room and bringing maybe a different perspective. There are very practical issues like childcare and transportation. And are you able to continue the commitments that you have to your family while working? So those issues about where will childcare come from, how do you get to and from work, are similar to women all over the world. What I would tell girls and young women entering the labor force, though, is something that one of my mentors early in my career told me after I had my first child. I have 2 daughters. Okay. So I know what it is to be a working mother. And she said, just stick with it. Somehow stay in the labor force. Don't drop out. Do something, even if it's part-time or if you take a little bit of a sidestep into a career path you didn't consider, just do something because it's much easier. Believe it or not, your kids are going to grow up and go to school before you know it. When they're babies, it seems like forever, but trust me, it goes by very fast. And so just stick with it because before you know it, you'll be in a different life position and it's much easier to stay in the workforce and get back on a career track that you wanted to have if you manage to hang in there. The years before kids go to school are actually quite short as you look back on it, although it doesn't feel that way at the time.
And you mentioned that there is a lack of female participation when it comes to managerial positions and top tier positions. Is IFC doing anything to address this in Bangladesh particularly?
We are. We have a program called Empower Women where we're working with about 30 large companies on raising awareness of the importance of diversity in leadership and gender awareness around harassment and some of the unconscious bias that hold women back. And these companies are committing to putting more women in leadership positions and on their corporate board of directors. And this is really important because for young women starting out at lower level positions, it's important to be able to see role models, potential mentors, and to see it can be done. If you don't see women in leadership positions, then it's hard to dream that that could be you. So I think that it is a bit of a snowball effect. Once you start to make the shift, then you're going to have more young women coming up. And some of the changes in how men and everyone perceive women leaders will start to shift. But I'll be honest, I think that there's still a long way to go in probably most countries around the world.
Okay. Susan, your insights have been very valuable to us. Thank you so much for coming to our show.
Thank you.
And that is all for today. Stay tuned for our next episode. We are going to have an exciting new guest.